So first of all, obviously, John's given me a lovely introduction this morning. So thank you so much, John. But for anyone that doesn't know, I work for a consultant that prioritises supporting charity and not-for-profit sector. And we have done a lot of work with councils over the last 6 years and have a partnership with NOUT as well. We offer a range of services to suit all sizes of buildings. So we mainly focus on finding the right energy contract for your building, account management and support, net zero planning, and carbon reporting and audits. So if you've got any questions on any of those areas, always feel free to email me. But today's agenda really is about opening up by talking about what's going on in the markets and what we can expect to see next year in Q1, energy saving tips and things to consider and look at when it comes to your energy provision. And then the final part of today's session is going to be looking at net zero planning. And the idea of that is to really give you a sort of overview of the key things to look at when you're planning that journey to a greener future. So to start off with, I thought we'd start the day with a really exciting graph, which I know you all must be really excited to see at this hour in the morning. So this is an overview of what's been happening with oil, gas and electricity prices this year. And we are looking at these on a regular basis in utility aid, and we have people who are market experts that analyse what kind of market trends we're seeing. So the end of September, something really big happened, and we saw the end of the UK's 142 history of coal-fired generation as Ratcliffe Power Station closed its furnaces for the last time. So this is big. This is a big deal for sustainability, but it also brings in a couple of concerns about our future as a country. For anyone that's not already aware, over the last couple of years, we have seen huge fluctuations in energy prices. But long before that, there's been a really big concern about how are we going to operate as a country going forwards with our energy? How are we going to store it? Do we have enough? Do we have enough to meet the demands of our supply? And how do we balance that with being more sustainable and prioritising green, clean energy going forwards? And this is an example of this. So the complete demise of coal is all more remarkable when you consider that it's made up 39% of electricity output. As recently as 2012, underwent something of a revival in more recent years to shore up winter capacity. So for the last couple of years, we haven't been able to meet the demands of the supply that we've needed, and we've needed to rely on other countries to fulfill that need for us. Hence why when we saw Russia invade Ukraine, we saw huge disruptions to our energy supply. There's a lot of concerns over the next couple of years of how we're going to manage that going forwards. And this is why we tend to see big fluctuations when we see spikes in weather. So for example, if there's a cold snap, we'll see prices increase, not only because there's an increase in demand, but there's an increased need and concern about where we're going to get that energy supply from. So the general advice at the moment on the markets is that it all depends on so many things that are outside of our control. Number one, weather. We don't know what the weather's going to be like 100%, and it can chop and change. So the second one would be things like geopolitical issues that are going to impact our supply, because we're relying on other countries to provide us with things like liquefied natural gas to make up the differences that we're seeing. Also, if we don't have a lot of wind, for example, we don't have certain temperatures, we don't have enough sunlight, we're then not making up the shortfall with renewable generation. So my advice would be, if you've got contracts that are coming up for renewal in 2025, give yourself enough time to make an informed decision. Normal sort of patterns of when we would expect to see prices drop are not always as obvious as they used to be. You probably remember a couple of years ago, people would say, oh, if you buy in the summer, it'd be cheaper. But due to the impact of global warming, we're seeing more people use things like air conditioning units and things like that. So we're seeing these peaks and troughs not form the sort of normal trend that we would see a couple of years ago. So give yourself enough time. Give yourself at least 6 months to make an informed decision with yourself and your colleagues, and start searching the market for a provider that's right for you, that gives you that certainty that the price won't change. When I'm talking about that, I'm talking about fixed contracts. There's a difference between a fixed contract and a fully fixed contract. And what you're looking to do really, if you want 100%, my prices are not going to move, you want a fully fixed contract that fixes the commodity cost, so the energy itself, and the non-commodity cost, which is everything within your contract that's not associated to the supply itself. Obviously, any questions on that, do let me know. I'm more than happy to take you through a couple of examples. Which takes me on to understanding your current bills. So when we've been doing a lot of research in the sector and to see what kind of issues people are struggling with, inaccurate bills is up there. Around 20% of utility bills are actually incorrect, and this results in organisations paying more than what they need to. There are two areas where we see this most commonly, and one of them is estimated readings. It's probably no surprise to everybody. But suppliers are only legally required to read your meter once every 2 years. So that's a manual come around and have a look at your meter and do a check. If you currently do not have a smart meter, or maybe you're experiencing problems in having one installed, and you're not taking regular meter readings and submitting them to the supplier, your bill most likely will be overestimated. And this is simply because the supplier doesn't want to be chasing you for a catch-up bill. So on that and see if that's the case on your invoice. It's very easy to know if you've been estimated because it will usually say E next to it, and if it's an actual meter reading it will say A next to it, and if it's a customer meter reading it will say C next to it, so you'll know which ones are correct. But a really important thing to check on your invoices. The second thing that causes a lot of problems in the sector is VAT and climate change levy charges, which is otherwise known as CCL. So the weird thing about VAT and CCL is they're interlinked with each other on utility bills. So some organisations will be charged 20% and others will be charged 5%. But what you will see is your CCL charge change with your VAT charge. So, for example, if you have a supply that goes under de minimis, which is basically the threshold that they classify a domestic supply. So if you had a small hall that consumes under 10,000 kilowatts a year, that would usually be categorized as domestic supply, and you would see your usage drop, your VAT level drop at 5%, and your climate change levy be removed automatically. When people get into a bit of a problem is where their readings are chopping and changing or are estimated. So for example, if a supplier is overestimating you, then you could then be being charged more VAT and climate change levy than what you need to. So really important thing to have a look at and see if that applies to you as well. Metering charges, another area on the bill where a lot of people have sometimes really strange meters. I've heard quite a few people talking about UMS supplies today, so please save your questions about those for the end and we can talk about those lovely supplies. I know how much in pain they are. But another area is something called a meter operator supply for a half-hourly meter. And this is something where a lot of organisations who are perhaps taking on buildings or properties where there's an existing supply already in there and the building was being used for something completely different, where they're being faced with metering charges that they haven't perhaps seen before. So I'll take you through a couple of examples of this and how this could affect you. And if you do have a half-hourly meter and this does affect you, feel free to let me know, we can go through it. But many organisations that we've come across who have got one of these in place are paying 60% more than what they need to on a meter operator agreement. Now, a meter operator agreement is a separate contract that covers specifically the maintenance and the cost of sending consumption data to the energy supplier for a certain type of supply. It's a completely separate contract to your electricity contract. You'll know if you have one of these because on your invoice, the meter will look like this. So we're looking specifically at the indicator here. If it has 00 in front of it, that's a half-hourly supply. So these meter operator agreements are specifically for these half-hourly supplies, and that's who it will affect. What you will have with a meter like this is separate charges for sending the consumption data directly to the supplier and to the grid. The problem that you do have with these kinds of meters, if, for example, you took on a building and it was open, let's say it was open from the hours of 7 a.m. till 12 p.m. at night, and you're taking on the supply and you're using it for completely different reasons. Perhaps you're only having it in the evenings between the hours of maybe 3 till 7, something like that. Your capacity charges and charges associated with that kind of supply are going to be completely different. You're not going to need the same amount of energy stored for the supply going forwards. So you could be being charged irregularities that you don't need to be charged for going forwards. So best thing to do, go and check your invoices, check your meter number, check your supply point here. And if you have a 00 meter, let me know and we can have a look and see if you're being charged more than what you need to on this type of tariff. I promised energy saving tips. So the first section of today has all been about like things that you can look at on your invoices and changes you can make today and things you can check to see if you're being overcharged. This section is all about practical things that you can put in place within your organization that will make a difference to how much you're consuming and hopefully alter human behaviors in the process. That would be nice, wouldn't it? Because that is a big part of making energy savings. So creating a culture, when we talk about reducing consumption, helping organizations reach their net zero goals, we often talk about creating a culture. This is really important. If you've got a building or a property where you've got multiple stakeholders involved, you can't make any changes if everyone is not on the same page with what you're trying to achieve. Why are you trying to achieve it? What benefit does that bring to everybody that's involved? And how are people going to help you on that journey? So try doing things like having organization-wide meetings to consider ideas or creating something like an energy champion. Now, an energy champion is specifically put in place not to stand there and wag the finger at people for leaving things on, but to really help you with pushing that culture through the organization of this energy saving change. It can also help with things like when you've got the temperature battles, which I know a lot of organizations have, we have them too. It will help alleviate that and help you get through that if you can all agree on a temperature that everyone's happy with and understanding what the organization is up against when it comes to financials. It can really support with that. So consider if you have an organization culture that supports that. Another thing to look at when you're looking at reducing your costs is something called an AMR meter. An AMR meter is slightly different to a smart meter. It's an automated meter reading device. And the main difference between that and a smart meter is it lets you review your consumption data in both operational and non-operational times. And this is really important because sometimes when you're looking at things outside of business hours, you can start to see where anomalies are in your consumption and you can start attacking those areas first. We had a chap who installed an AMR meter into a village hall and found out that there was a spike that kept happening at night time from about 11 o'clock. Turns out they had the heater in a locked cupboard and it was set on a timer from 11 to put everything on full blast, even though nobody was using the hall at that time. So if you start to put these things in place, you can start to pinpoint where your pain points are and make changes that will lasting change on your costs. Your energy tariff. So when we're talking about energy tariffs, we're talking specifically about how you're using them and how are you putting them in place. So are you getting the best value for money from your energy tariff? It might be that you have a hall or a building where you've got certain activities that require maybe the heating to be on at certain times. Maybe you need to require to have outside lighting on at certain times of the day. If it's in the evening, your tariff will have a cheaper time of day that you can operate these things on. So if you have a day, a night, a weekend, an evening tariff, look at which time it's cheaper for you to run certain activities and try changing your timetable of activities to reflect that so you're getting the best out of your tariff that you possibly can. Ghost of energy past. So when I'm talking about ghost of energy past, I'm talking about phantom energy. So anybody that has grandkids, children, or perhaps even like your other halves that do this, I know it drives me nuts. Yes, I'm a delight to live with. I'm always looking at ways in which we can reduce energy. But one of the things to look at is things like phantom energy. So that's for things that you've got plugged in that aren't in active use. And it's massive, it's big. And in every organization we go into and do assessments for, it's the first thing we look at is where's the wasted energy. Every organization has a base load, and this is before you go in and switch anything on. This would be, for example, if you had electricity or usage for lighting, stuff like that, that's on already before you've even entered the building. Any alarms you have, for example, that kind of stuff. So try looking at areas where you've got phantom energy and then removing the opportunity for people to leave them on. So simple way to resolve this would be trying to have all your computer peripherals, your printers, your monitors connected to power strips. So it's really easy for people to completely shut a room down once they've finished using it. And this is when you would engage with the energy champion side and how they could help you with getting the staff on board for moving things and doing things in a slightly different way. It sounds like an obvious one, but controlling the temperature. Again, it's something we see all the time, even when you go to businesses and hotels and things like that. You go into some rooms and you think, crikey, the heating's on here, or the air conditioning's on awful high. But heating, ventilation, and air conditioning can account for up to 60% of energy costs. So think about setting your temperature controls correctly. And this again would be when you would engage with your energy champions and the wider team and agree on temperatures that everyone feels comfortable with, using guides that are available for like what would be a good time. So for example, the Energy Saving Trust recommend heating your home between 18 to 21 in the winter. So worth like having a look at that and engaging with your team and agreeing on a temperature that everyone's happy with. But it can be a huge, huge cost for organizations. Net zero planning. So obviously quite a few people have said that they're on their net zero journey at the moment, or they're actively looking at ways in which they can reduce their carbon output. But I get asked all the time, how do you start this journey and what are the key things that I should be looking at to make sure I don't miss a beat in this journey? So this section is about really getting started and what are the differences between scope 1 and 2 and 3, and how do you do it in a way that will make sure that you have the best success with the project. So getting started, the first step before you do anything with looking at your net zero journey is you need to know what you're currently doing right now. You need to know what your current carbon footprint is. And the only way you can do that is by having a carbon footprint assessment. And that involves looking at things like your greenhouse gas emissions from both direct and indirect sources. And there are a number of ways in which you can do that. It depends on how detailed you want the carbon footprint and how accurate you want that carbon footprint. So step one, you could look at free tools. There's a number of free tools that you can use out there. I've got a couple of links that I'd be happy to share, where you can input all your sort of outputs that you currently have, and it will give you a rough calculation of your carbon emissions. The other way, which is a bit more detailed, is when you're working with an energy assessor who knows specifically how to calculate that for you and will help you look through all your different outputs as an organization that are both indirect and direct and give you a carbon footprint. You've got a carbon footprint number and you know what that currently is. This is all about next steps in finding out which bits can you make reductions for and setting yourself a target that is achievable. It's not a one-time task looking at your carbon footprint, but you need to start looking at it every year. So if you're making changes and they're having a beneficial effect, you'll only know that if you then look at your carbon footprint again in a year's time. So set your carbon footprint, put some positive changes in place that have an effect on it, measure it. Have you made a difference? If so, great, celebrate it, tell everyone about what you're doing. And then you can review it again the following year. Which takes me nicely onto scopes 1, 2, and 3. So you've done your carbon footprint, you know what your output is. You've set yourself a target that's achievable, but still pushes yourself a little bit, but it's achievable. You then need to start looking at, well, okay, well, how do we get there and what changes do we need to make as an organization? And the easiest way to do that is by separating your carbon outputs into scopes 1, 2, and 3 and doing them one at a time. So scope 1, for anyone that's not sure, covers greenhouse gas emissions that a company makes directly. So that would be, for example, while you're running your boilers or your vehicles that you may have. That's direct sources that you've made. And this would be part of the list process that you would do with an energy assessor or internally. If you were looking at all your different outputs, this would be scope 1, all the things that we do directly. One of the things that you could do to make a big change on that would be, for example, you could look at electrical vehicle points or having electrical chargers. I've seen quite a few people doing that, and it's having a positive impact on their carbon output. Scope 2, these are emissions organizations make indirectly. So again, when you're going through that process of listing all these things, anything that you would put in this section would be things like when the electricity or energy you buy for heating or cooling your buildings is being produced on your behalf. So this would be when you would look at things like, okay, well, how do we go for a green supplier? That's going to help us. I know it's difficult picking a green supplier, and it can be quite challenging because it's not always obvious whether somebody is actually 100% green. Again, try and go with suppliers that produce the green energy themselves. So somebody like, for example, Ecotricity or SSE, for example, they generate their own green energy. I think Ecotricity is actually vegan. So there's not much greener than a vegan energy. So try looking at energy suppliers that can help you with reducing your carbon output in that way. And scope 3 is probably the one that fills most people with dread. This is a category that looks at all emissions associated with, not with the organisation itself, the organisation is indirectly responsible for up and down its value chain. An example of this would be from when you're buying products from your suppliers, and from its products when customers use them. So a very basic example would be if you were a zoo, for example, and you've got a toy shop, gift shop, and you're buying your cuddly toys from a warehouse in China, well, then you've got to think about what you're responsible for in those goods coming to you. And then what are those made of? Are they made of environmentally sustainable materials? How are you contributing to the wider issue by promoting something like that? But remember, you don't need to carry all of these things out at once. That's the thing that people forget sometimes. Carry them out in stages and do the ones that are the low-hanging fruit first. Do the easy ones that are easy to achieve, that you can celebrate and tell people how you've made an impact. And then the ones that are more difficult, those are the ones that you take your time and make sure that you're doing something not only for the best environmental purposes, but also for the best financial purposes for yourselves as well. Some things you won't be able to necessarily change or reach net zero on because you might have built-in carbon already into a historical building, for example. But if you show that you've done the research and you've tried and you've put things in place, then that's all you can do. There's nothing much more you can do. That's when you can start looking at alternatives. How can you promote sustainability in the community? How can you help with planting more trees, for example? That's when you would start investigating things like that. But first step, scope 1, things that you can tackle straight on. Scope 2, easy low-hanging fruit, is looking at green energy suppliers.